was thinking about how poorly role playing texts have helped me learn what to do with failed roles. And it is kind of sad to say, maybe, that the most common thing I can think of is that if a roll fails and I or the game master doesn't want it to fail, that they're supposed to pretend that it didn't fail. And that I'm thinking textually across all these rule books, all these core books, all these system rules that I know about. And I'm saying, when has failure ever been mentioned? And by far the most common instruction is, well, it didn't. So that's one weird thing, is that is those instructions. And then there's also the option that I see in the texts, which is, well, they failed, but give them something else to do, and then sooner or later they'll succeed, and then make that the important thing, which is kind of the same idea, right? To say, well, if a failure is rolled, so really, on the other hand, I mean, we've see games in which the consequences of failure are dire. So it's weird. I mean, we have all these systems in which the consequences of failure can be very, very damaging to a character or a situation. But then we have advice to say, well, ignore that. I mean, we are digging into very deep waters here, because we're talking about a long history of role playing games and strange absences of saying, how do you honor the failed resolution so that there's a reason why you're using these systems? I mean, there's a reason we're using these systems of failed, and the possibility of failing your skill check, or the possibility of failing to hit an opponent, the possibility of failing your death save, right?
Mm-hmm.
For Helma, you may or may not be aware of the original rules for what were called saving throws in Dungeons and Dragons, whereby under certain circumstances it was simply a single life or death roll. If you were poisoned, you had a number and you had to roll that number or higher. And if you didn't, your character simply died on the spot. And then there were certain other, I mean, the same thing. There was another roll for if you get turned to stone. And if you failed it, the Gorgon's gaze looks at you, you fail your save against petrification, which was its own number, and you failed it, and you're a statue forever. You're done, right? So,
or even worse, the when the beholder's eye ray hit you, you're disintegrated. Poof,
right,
you're gone.
right.
Nothing even left to turn
Nothing to
back to.
loot. Even worse.
Nothing to loot either, no.
Yeah, son
And
of
no
a
statue to
bitch.
bring home. Or
Yeah. So the point is that we do have a history of dire consequences, even just, almost eviction consequences. Stop playing. And then we also have a history of the somewhat more ambiguous, well, the situation of failing to hit, which isn't necessarily fatal in and of itself, but statistically, puts you a little down in your encounter. And then you have the much more ambiguous thing of failing a skill roll. I try to do this and I fail. Then there's always the fascinating subset too of failed perception checks. What does that mean when you fail to notice something? Which is, we dealt with that in some other dialogues, I think. But in this case, I really just want to go straight to it. What are our experiences of failed rolls? And when I say rolls, any kind of resolution system that has uncertain properties, whatever they are, right? I maintain there's a way to have a lot of fun with these. even really productive concepts of how to have fun with these. But what are our experiences with them?
Mm,
I mean, what?
what kind of examples do you want? Like anything that says in the resolution system, okay, there is a fail on the roll. What happens?
Right. And sometimes the text will have a little paragraph there, and sometimes it won't, depending on the rule set or the skill or whatever. And so sometimes we know exactly what it means. Your character drops dead in their tracks. Other times we don't. So to answer your question, we are starting with a blank slate right now. We are talking about anything of this kind.
Well, how about we go back in time
Mhm.
and look at the first 3 decades of the role-playing game rules, where the majority of you failed your roll was nothing happens.
True. And so if let's also look back at those games where you did have, for example, skill sets, but they were usually very narrow skill sets. They became much bigger skill sets in the 80s. But at first, you had very narrow skill sets. So you not only had combat success and failure, basically shooting someone or hitting them with an axe or not, you also had skill checks like in Early Traveler, even the skill systems in what was considered a skill heavy game like the Fantasy Trip, they were really small skill sets compared to what was to come. And then you had, interestingly enough, doing other things that weren't covered by the skill sets or mechanics at all. At all. I mean, when you negotiated with somebody in playing old Dungeons and Dragons, when you did practically anything except pick a lock or, climb a wall or break a door in old Dungeons and Dragons, there was no resolution system for it.
Yeah,
it was just negotiating, and theoretically, it was the GM. Does the GM think the NPC was persuaded?
Right, or do they? Any number of things. And I would also point, there was only one customizable game I can think of before. I mean, in the very first round of games, only Tunnels and Trolls had a generic resolution system, where you could choose what attribute was important in the situation and then just roll. They called it a save, but it wasn't a saving throw. It was a resolution roll. But what happens when you failed it? What happens when you say in Tunnels and Trolls, I roll to do this, and the game master says, oh, well, I bet that's a dexterity roll. Go ahead and roll. And you fail. This is really what I'm after. So, Alan, go ahead, go back in time. Tell us about that phase. What you mean when you say that?
Well, I was thinking primarily of combat roles in early versions of Dungeons and Dragons. Particularly spent a fair amount of time playing advanced Dungeons and Dragons First Edition, and I don't believe it had any skills. Those were introduced later.
Not as such. They had a few class abilities with percentages and stuff like that. Yeah.
Oh yeah, sure. There were the thief abilities.
Right.
And some other things got added in Oriental Adventures, I think.
Yeah, Wilderness Adventures, I think, is notorious for introducing that stuff.
Have some other stuff add. And that were mostly I think they were just stat rolls.
Right.
Sort of saving throws, but the other way around. But
that's later. Let's go back and talk about it when
my actual experience during that phase using that was that now my group didn't come up with didn't actually click into the idea of rolling, for example, characteristics to resolve just general stuff.
Yeah. To me, that wasn't present. I got that through the Fantasy Trip and through Tunnels and Trolls, but it wasn't part of Dungeons and Dragons culture at the time at all.
Yeah.
And again, it was very much a matter of, well, I try to do this, and if it wasn't something that was listed in the class features, the dungeon master would just basically say you did or you didn't. But and then you had all of your is it realistic, for you to say that arguments would crop up. But really isn't. So what was added, what was gained by, for example, in RuneQuest, you had your short skill list, and that skill list exponentially increased in size. So even by 1984, in the Avalon Hill edition, you have this immense skill list. So you have all these things. What does it mean to fail your... I mean, there are certain things that were... Knowing what it meant when it failed was straightforward. If you failed your spot hidden, you didn't see the thing. You didn't see the gleam of the statuette from behind the refuse. So you don't get the statue. It's basically your chance to get the statue. And
there was often this situation where the GM would ask for spot hidden, and players would assume that, well, even if I failed, there must have been something.
Then you get the dysfunctional behavior of demanding a spot hidden roll repeatedly, right? And then you also, but then there was, and then there's the what they ultimately split that into spot hidden and scan, which was basically avoid ambush. You fail your scan roll, and that means the thing's going to drop on your head, and you're going to lose a round of combat or something. And then you have your, in Dungeons and Dragons of the time, you didn't have like a personal ability to do that. You had a generic ability across the party as to whether they were surprised collectively or not.
In early versions, it was just roll a d6. And
exactly.
I can't remember what the number was. But
I think if you roll a 5 and a 6, you were surprised or something like that. And that was all of you, just the whole group.
Yeah.
But in the case that therefore in those situations, the failure was known ahead of time, what it means. It was a tactical setup for what you either got or didn't get. But what happens when you start getting scenarios, published scenarios, where finding the statuette is important later? And you're the game master, you've read this scenario, you've read about the statuette, you've studied the religion of the Newtlings. I'm thinking of, the Rainbow Mounds, an early RuneQuest adventure. And if you don't find that little statuette, then you're not going to get the blessing of that goddess later. And you're the GM and you're kind of excited about all this stuff. You want to share it. You feel like you studied this fun adventure where it wasn't a dungeon. It was a historical, set of archaeological layers of who had moved in when, and you liked this history. And yet here go the players missing their scan roll and not seeing the statuette. Right? Yeah. How fun is that? Now we're playing without the statuette. Great. Am I supposed to revel?
I've been the GM in that situation many times over the years. And it's basically they fail, and then I provide I insert some other clue into the ongoing game, whether
or you stick the statuette into the next room. Right, you just sort of pluck the statuette out of that room and put it into the next room until they find the fucking thing, right?
Yeah.
So the point then really comes down to, what about failure of something that is rather important to the character concept? And you may even have thrown, if you have the chance in this game, like GURPS or something, you've thrown a ton of points into this character build so that you've got 16 or better, or 16 or less on 3d6 to make to do this thing. And you're fine with a lower chance if it's in adverse circumstances. It goes, we're on slippery ice. I get it. I'm -4. I accept that. But what if you're not on slippery ice? So if you fail, right, you're -4 and you fail and you're like, cool, I fall on the ice. I get it, right? Being on the slippery ice and my reduced chance, and the fact that I fail, I'm actually invested in the fact that my character, competent as they are, could well have slipped, unless I'm wussy or something. But, if we're into what we're doing, then that's actually pretty gettable. You're like, all right, we're on the slippery ice. But what if we're not on the slippery ice and I have my 16 or less and I roll and I get my 17 or 18?